Hello, HDFS 310. This is Spencer, your GTA for this course. Unfortunately, due to a scheduling conflict, I haven't been able to attend class in person and meet you all, but I'm very excited to be able to connect with you through this week's lecture module. This week, we will be learning about gender identity development, specifically in middle childhood. The learning objective for this week in this PowerPoint is for students to be able to recognize the difference between sex and gender, to be able to differentiate the various components that make up one's gender identity, to describe the current theories of gender development and compare and contrast differences, and to understand what it means to be transgender. So let's get started. First up is sex and gender. What's the difference? One sex assigned at birth is the sex that the medical community labels a person when they are born. Typically, one is either labeled a male, a female, or intersex. This is based on a number of factors, including but not limited to one's sex chromosomes, presence of gonads, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia. Then gender refers to the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. So what this means is that gender is culturally contextual, and different types of cultures and groups of people will have different norms on what is referred to as gender normative, which are behavior aligned with cultural expectations, and what would be considered gender nonconforming, behavior that is different from these expectations. So in other words, gender is a culturally contextual phenomenon rather than a universal or inherent one. Now it's time to go over what the elements of gender are and key terms for the rest of this presentation. Gender identity refers to how one labels their gender experience, usually something like man, woman, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or etc. There are dozens of labels that one can use to identify their gender, but gender identity just refers to how one person labels their own gender experience. Gender expression is how one displays their gender through external cues, such as speech, behavior, clothing, accessories, hairstyle, jewelry, etc. Gender roles and stereotypes refers to the culturally specific aspects of gender identity that we are socialized into. For example, in our culture, one thing that is socialized into us is that girls wear pink and boys wear blue, or things like women are teachers and men are engineers. Gender attributes is how other people perceive and label another's gender identity. Then lastly, gender diversity is the wide range of gender identities, expressions, and stereotypes that usually fall out of binary identities, but is an umbrella term to describe the various components and ways that gender identity can be expressed. This is a visual model to help you understand those terms. So in the center, you can see that we have gender identity. This is an internal factor in how one identifies themselves. Then you can see that there is an external triangle that includes the external factors that impact gender identity. The first one is the sex assigned at birth, so what the medical community labels you. Then in the bottom right, we have gender expression. This is how you externally display your gender. Then at the top, you have gender attribution, which is how your gender is perceived by others. So let's pause and take a moment to think about your own gender identity. First, think about how do you identify today? Then, think about what are some ways that you are expressing your gender today. This could be things like the clothes you're wearing, any jewelry you may have on, presence or absence of makeup, nail polish, anything that falls into how gender can be expressed or perceived. Then, think about how might this change on a different day, or how could this change throughout the day? Lastly, reflecting on your childhood, when do you first remember being aware about gender? Take a moment to pause and think about the answers to these questions. Next up, we're going to talk about the various theories of how gender develops through one's childhood. The 5 theories that we will go over are behaviorism, social cognitive theory, cognitive development theory, gender schema theory, and last up, the gender self-socialization model. First up is behaviorism. Broadly speaking, behaviorism is a theory of behavior and development in which all behaviors are learned through interactions with one's environment through the process of conditioning. Wanted behaviors are encouraged with things like praise, rewards, acceptance, etc. And unwanted behaviors are discouraged through things such as punishments, exclusion, criticism, and more. Examples of this related to gender that children might hear while growing up are things like, boys don't cry, nice girls don't get angry, you are so strong like that action figure, you dress up your Barbie to look so beautiful. The process of behavioral conditioning occurs frequently throughout development related to gender identity. Take a moment to think about these questions. How would parents react if a girl wanted to play with a football or a boy wanted to play with a Barbie? How might school peers react if a boy showed up to school in a princess costume or if a girl showed up in a mechanic costume? In the US, most of our behaviors, interests, and jobs are gendered at the societal level and are enforced at the relational and individual level. Next up is social cognitive theory. Social cognitive theory describes how behavior, cognition, and personality are formed by individuals observing others' social behavior, interaction with others, and media portrayals of various social groups. This diagram at the bottom shows how these three elements of social, cognitive, and personality factors all impact each other through observations throughout one's development. This concept of social, cognitive, and personality factors are very prevalent for gender roles and how children learn to fit into or outside of society's gender stereotypes. For children raised in homes with two caregivers in a presumed heterosexual relationship, this is usually the first place where children observe people filling gender roles. This might look something like parents enforcing gendered housework. An example of this would be that the woman or the mother cooks and cleans, and the man or the father does things like the outside labor, mechanical work, or finances. Parents and caregivers can also demonstrate gendered clothing. For example, that women wear dresses, skirts, heels, and makeup, and men wear things like pants, suits, ties, and no makeup. Take a moment to think about how your parents, if you were raised with two parents or caregivers, either enforced or challenged various gender stereotypes as you were growing up. Next up is cognitive development theory. This is Piaget's theory of cognitive development, which states that children's intelligence and knowledge undergo changes as they grow and experience new things. Not only do children acquire new knowledge throughout development, but they build on their existing knowledge and developmental models of their world. Children's understanding of gender follows the same process according to Kohlberg's theory of gender development. This process could look something like starting with gender identity. This is when a child will realize that they identify as something like a boy, a girl, or androgynous. Then children will move into the stage of gender stability. This is things like, if I am a girl, I will be a girl in the future, or vice versa. Then the last stage in this is gender constancy. That even if I were to dress up or play like another sex, I will still be X gender. Now, this is not the process for all children, especially gender diverse children, but for cisgender children, this is usually the process of cognitive development that they undergo as they form and solidify their gender identity. Next up is gender schema theory. Broadly speaking, schema are the mental concepts that come from life experiences and interactions with the environment. These patterns of thought organize and categorize information and the relationships among the other categories in information. Gender schema theory posits that children learn gender roles from their culture by reinforcing or challenging gender schema. If we look at the model at the bottom, we can see that gender schema are in the pink box in the middle. Coming into that box is society's beliefs about the traits of females and males. Then the outcomes of gender schema are influences on self-esteem, i.e. learning what acceptable behaviors are, and influences on the processing of social information. Last up for our theories is the gender self-socialization model. The previous theories we've discussed have shown how external relationships in society socializes ourselves into gender roles, but children also self-socialize. Gender is usually one of the first social categories that they are introduced to and become aware of throughout their development. Because of this, children become something like gender detectives, in that they are intrinsically motivated to learn more and investigate what gender roles and norms mean. Children's understanding and awareness of gender impacts how they collect, organize, and interpret social information. Through this process, they begin to categorize general behaviors, themselves, and others into various gender stereotypes, finishing the feedback loop of socialization. Now that we have finished discussing the various theories of gender development, here is a quick learning checkpoint to sum up the key takeaways from what we have discussed so far. First is gender is different than biological sex, and gender roles are not inherent. Second, conceptualizations, roles, and stereotypes of gender exist in the context of culture. Third, gender socialization usually occurs as a process of feedback received from our environment. And lastly, children learn what is socially acceptable through social observation and behavioral conditioning. A common question among students and many parents with children are, when do children become aware of gender? The answer to this might surprise you. It's younger than most people think. According to a recent study, at around age 1, children do not segregate their play by gender, meaning that all children will play with different gendered stereotype toys the same amount. By age 3, children begin to learn what toys are considered acceptable based on their biological sex and gender. And then by age 5, most children's play will be gender segregated. However, girls tend to play with all toys more evenly, but boys will play with toys associated with femininity less than 10% of their playtime. So this also reflects a larger societal phenomenon in which girls tend to have more flexibility in their gender identity and gendered play, whereas boys do not have that same level of flexibility. But the takeaway from this is that by age 5, children are aware of and begin enforcing gender roles through their play. Next up, we are going to learn what it means to be transgender. Transgender is a broad umbrella term used to describe people whose gender identity is different from their sex/gender assigned at birth. Contrarily, cisgender is used to describe individuals whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. As you can see in this diagram to the right, transgender is an umbrella term that encompasses binary gender identities, i.e. a trans man or a trans woman, as well as non-binary gender identities. Non-binary is another umbrella term to describe dozens of various gender identities that fall outside of the typical binary identities of man or woman. Common ones among this umbrella would be things like genderqueer, gender fluid, bigender, and agender. But there are many other labels. Then, gender dysphoria is a term to describe a sense of discomfort and unease when one's gender identity does not correspond to their biological sex and gender attribution. For example, for someone who identifies as a trans man, if they have not undergone gender-affirming surgery or medical care and still have breasts, the presence of these might cause them gender dysphoria because the presence of breasts will usually result in other people attributing them to be a woman. Gender dysphoria is also a diagnosis used in the DSM, but the diagnosis is different than the general term to describe the feeling of dysphoria for gender diverse people. So thinking about gender diversity in the context of development, when do children realize they are trans? In a recent study, it was found that most children begin to understand and realize that they are transgender and or experience gender dysphoria by age 7. Additionally, most people experience gender dysphoria of various intensity on an average of 22 years before they are able to receive gender-affirming care. This means that for most gender diverse and transgender people, they aren't able to receive the health care that affirms their gender identity until they are almost 30 years old. So, what does transitioning or gender affirmation mean? The process of gender affirmation and transition will be different for every single gender diverse person. However, there are some common things that people may go through during this process. Elements of this process may or may not include things such as changing your clothing, your physical appearance, name, or pronouns. Some may choose to change their name legally and on documents, undergo hormone therapy, or other medical procedures. When thinking about this in the context of development, for children, the most common and usually the only option available for gender-affirming healthcare are hormone blockers. These prevent and or delay the onset of puberty to delay the permanent changes to our bodies while a child is still figuring out their gender identity, or if they have figured it out, to prevent these permanent changes and begin hormone replacement therapy. This is usually the first step for children when they realize that they are trans and the only available option. Gender-affirming care usually is only available to people who are adolescents. In most places in the U.S., individuals cannot access gender-affirming healthcare until they are 16 years old. This presents many developmental challenges. By 16, most people are already undergoing puberty. This means that their body is changing in a way that does not align with their gender identity and often increases the intensity of their gender dysphoria. Greater intensity and frequency of gender dysphoria is associated with increased depression, anxiety, bullying, lack of family acceptance, and suicidality. In other words, gender-affirming care can save a trans child's life and is very important for the well-being of these people and this population. So, in summary, these are the 3 main takeaways for this part of this presentation. First is children understand the concept of gender and gender roles by ages 5 to 7. Second, gender is a socially constructed phenomenon that is enforced through socialization during development. Lastly, transgender youth experience many risk factors. However, access to gender-affirming care is one of the most effective protective factors. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, would like more information, or access to the resources used in this presentation, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you so much and have a great week.